You're listening to Healthcare Now Radio. Stand by for This Just In, the latest in healthcare innovation and technology trends with your HIT advisor, Justin Barnes.
Thank you for tuning in and welcome to This Just In. I'm your host, Justin Barnes. In these half-hour segments, I'll bring you the latest advancements in healthcare, strategy, innovation, and public policy. As always, we're broadcasting from the This Just In studios on the Business Radio X network, as well as the Healthcare Now radio network. For this episode, though, my 159th episode, with a very special guest, Graham Osborn. Welcome to the show, Graham.
Thanks, Justin.
It's great to have you here. And we met about, 4 months or so ago. We were introduced by a great man, Charlie Paparelli. I think we both think highly of Charlie, but when I was with him at a high-tech prayer event, he brought up some research that you had just given to the Angel Lounge around just kind of blind spots for angel investors and entrepreneurs and just investment strategies kind of that you've come up with overall. So I'm very excited about diving into this.
Yeah, no, I had given a presentation, I guess earlier this year. It was in May or April or May, I think. But I've been attending Angel Lounge for I think about a year and a half now, and my voice is going a little bit today. By the way, I've got a cold, so apologies for that. But I had been thinking about angel investing because I was sort of introduced to thinking about it when I joined Charlie's group, and I could see that although people were talking about individual angel investments, they weren't really thinking about the composite return of a portfolio, and so that was what I wanted to look at. And as I started delving into that, I realized that there wasn't a lot of data for early stage investing to say what a portfolio should return, and so part of the purpose was to kind of extrapolate what are fairly well characterized mature company portfolio returns to what a early stage portfolio might return.
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty fascinated by what Charlie told me, and then when you and I met, just over coffee, just understanding, the probabilities of failure for different sized companies, probabilities of unicorns, and then, you even hit me kind of between the eyes a little bit when you said, some people, they sell their business and then think they can go off and be a great CEO for other businesses. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. And that was just really neat because a lot, and I know you got some cool data and we'll dive into all that, but it was just, I was very intrigued by our conversation, intrigued by what Charlie told me. So I'm looking very forward to diving into that here over the next 25 minutes or so. But quick question, are you part of the High Tech Prayer Breakfast? I know we talked about that offline. And if you're not,
so I was invited last year by a friend of mine, but I wasn't able to go, so I'm hoping to go this year.
Yeah, well, if you don't already have a seat, then I'm going to offer you a seat at my table. It's a great event. A couple thousand of us come together very early in the morning. I think it starts around 6:45 a.m.
That was the problem. I was sick that morning, which I'm sick today too. So something about that time of year. But yeah, it was a little too early for me with my head cold, but I appreciate the offer and I will take you up on that.
Awesome. Look forward to it. So let's dive in. First of all, before we get into the cool questions around entrepreneurialism and angel investing and all that good stuff, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up, attend college, all that good stuff?
Yeah. So I grew up playing the violin actually, but got carpal tunnel in college. So I went the pre-med route and went to medical school at University of Maryland. After that, I did a surgical internship and I started a business which didn't do so well out of that and worked in the pharmaceutical industry, drug development and the oncology space for a couple of years and started investing during that time and was not very good at it to begin with. So I spent a lot of time studying the approaches of different investors and kind of converged on Warren Buffett's approach as being the only one that really suited my personality. There were other more active strategies that seemed to work for some people, but if you were looking for long-term data indicating a very statistically high probability of success. His is the best documented track record for pretty much any investor.
Very true. He actually, I just saw today where Berkshire Hathaway made their first individual private company invested. It was an Indian company, and I read that.
Pay to you or something.
That's it. Yes, exactly that. But I couldn't agree with you more there. So tell us a little bit about, before we dive into the kind of the cool part around the blind spots for angel investors and entrepreneurs, which everybody's going to be excited to hear about, as I was, but tell us about your investment thesis a little bit.
I mean, my basic investment thesis is kind of the Buffett thesis, which is if you buy a appropriately diversified basket of businesses and you buy them for less than they're worth based on your current assessment of the fundamentals of the business, then you should make money over time. And so the real two questions you have to answer: number one, what's the appropriate level of diversification for the kind of business I'm investing in, considered as a class? And then number two, what is the way that I value a business of this type?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So from your research, and this is what really got me in, and I had to learn a lot of this the hard way over the last 20 years of being an entrepreneur, being an executive angel, being a passive angel, and passive investing. But everything that you're about to walk through, I kind of had to learn the hard way, and you kind of learned it through studying, and I'm sure a lot of other people's failures, which is great. It's a great way to learn. But from your research, what is the probability of failure for a seed stage company?
Well, I mean, it's a hard question to answer because if you think about it, there's a lot of, as soon as you look at a company, then you're changing the statistics. And if you are selecting among companies, then of your selection set, that probability will be different as well. There's a whole field of statistics called Bayesian probability that kind of deals with, preconditioned probabilities. And people are very psychologically poor at kind of identifying what the preconditions are for the probabilities they assign. But when I just kind of think of it off the cuff, the probability that any given company that somebody proposes and actually follows through on, I usually assume that there's at least a 70% probability that it will fail, or that it will, not even get off the ground in any meaningful way to begin with. But the actual failure probability, if you went out, 5 years, would probably be much higher than that. But again, it's highly dependent. So you always have to incorporate a margin of safety when you're calculating when you're saying what failure rate you should assume in a portfolio.
Yeah, and I feel you're pretty spot on. Just from, again, my work out in the industry and just kind of saying, I got pretty fortunate. My first company with HBO and Company, we sold that to McKesson, and that was a great opportunity. And then we peeled off and built a company, Relay Health, which sold that back to McKesson, and then built the company Greenway. So I actually had 3 great hits in a row. Just very, very fortunate. But now that actually took up 20 years of my life. And then now, after we sold Greenway, I went off and took some time off, and then looked around the industry and certainly wanted to invest and do more angel investing. But as I would cozy up to companies, and I actually just had a meeting this morning with an equity fund here in Atlanta. I really do see why 9 out of 10 companies fail. And I know your probability is at 70%. You're giving some room for error, but I really do see how, you have a less than a 10% chance of making it 5 years. And it's actually easy to see. And so there's a lot of people who think they're entrepreneurs and they think they're going to be successful and they have a cool idea and they think they can raise, $500,000 from friends and family, but then it doesn't go anywhere. And you can see a lot of that stuff in the early days. And that's kind of what over the last 4 years, since we sold Greenway, I've been doing a lot of work in that space and have only made some very strategic investments, actually based on even some of your findings, because of understanding that failure rate. And, like I said, 90%, I don't think don't make it. So I think you found something similar.
Yeah. And, the other part of it is what what does failure mean? And I think everybody's got kind of their own definition of that. But the place where you see the most kind of reality distortion is in asking an individual entrepreneur, what is the probability of failure of your company? And of course, what do you think most people will answer to that? But that, to me, that 2%. Sort of, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the role of the investment mentality, is to be able to step outside of that reality distortion field and look down from above and kind of, be able to coldly and analytically assess probabilities. That's why I like the way that you look at things, because I'm an internal optimist, and you look at the data and the numbers and the research and the past trends, and I think it's very cool. So from your research and what you've seen recently, what do you feel the probability of a unicorn for a seed stage company is? Well, I was just looking up some data right before we got on the call here. So there's, according to the SBA or whatever, there's 300 or about 400,000 businesses started a year. Presumably only a portion of those are technology startups, and of those only a portion are product-oriented technology startups, which for, when I think about angel investing, it's typically in that category. But there's only about 260 unicorns in the entire world right now. So if you were talking about all businesses, then the probability, if you started, a business and I didn't tell you anything else about it, that it would end up being a unicorn would probably be less than 100,000. But the operating question when you're an investor isn't so much what is the probability that, the laundromat down the street is going to turn into a unicorn. The question is more of the subset of businesses that I choose to invest in based on my selection ability. What is the probability within that set? And that's a hard question to answer. There's guys like Chris Sacca who appear to have a selection probability in excess of 2%, maybe as high as 5%. He's hit on Stripe and Hinge and Facebook and Twitter and a number of other companies. It also depends on where you're fishing, right? Yes. If you're fishing in a place where there just historically aren't that many unicorns, either because lack of HR talent or lack of capital or, lack of partnership opportunities, all those are preconditioning probabilities, so to speak. But I think if you're in Silicon Valley and you have a high selection ability and deal access, ability to access deals as well, you could probably get up to 1 to 5% for specific investors. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a different environment. I mean, I started one company out in Silicon Valley. That was the Relay Health, and it was totally different sledding than starting a company on the East Coast. But I also wouldn't change anything. I actually made a lot more money on the company that started on the East Coast than the one on the West Coast. But I completely agree with your findings there. So your next piece, and this is out of your your 10 blind spots for entrepreneurs and angel investors. But what's your thesis on managerial oversight versus a company run by an excellent CEO you don't control? This is pretty fascinating what you and I talked about here. I think that every investor has a circle of competence. That's kind of a Buffett catechism. And then I think that everybody has a managerial circle of competence as well. But the managerial circle of competence is typically much narrower than the investment circle of competence. And that becomes the tricky thing for a lot of people because you or I might be very well suited to run a certain business, but we might be very poorly prepared to run another sort of business. And I think sometimes people who have started 1 or 2 or 3 businesses in a particular area successfully may overestimate their ability to jump in and run a semi-unrelated or totally unrelated business, with a similar level of skill, just because the nature of the market and the nature of the customer may be fundamentally different. If you look at Buffett's career, he was oftentimes very involved at a managerial level at the insurance companies, but for other sorts of businesses, he almost never got involved at that level. So he wanted to find managers he could see, from his vantage point were good, but he didn't want to have to, guide them or babysit them in any way. And I think that's kind of when you're going to be a passive investor, or when you're in a company where you don't have the level of knowledge required to run the company, you have to be able to recognize that, number one, but number two, you've got to be able to identify general characteristics of good managers based on either track record or industry references or whatever. And then you have to be able to delegate, responsibility and not micromanage that manager. The only case where you can really get away with micromanaging is if you're, truly a domain expert in that area. And I think a lot of people maybe get into situations where the investment becomes complicated to manage because they overestimate their ability to kind of step in and help run any sort of business.
I completely agree. And for those that may have joined us a little late, my guest today is Graham Osborn, and we're talking about the blind spots that angel investors and entrepreneurs have. And I love the topic because a lot of us have it. So speak a few minutes on your thesis about failing to appreciate the role of luck in every entrepreneurial success, because this is pretty fascinating when we talked about this.
Yeah, this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with the reality distortion field of every entrepreneur. But, if you have a successful company, then the probability that, the probability that you'll still have a successful company next year is probably, greater than 80%, I would say. But when you go from exiting, your first successful company to investing in various companies, then your entire worldview is influenced by the character of that, what that outcome was. For example, I started 2 small businesses and they both failed. So I have a different kind of worldview than somebody who, started a business and their first business out of college, like a Gates or a Zuckerberg was, it was phenomenally successful. But it's hard for a person from that vantage point to realistically appraise the probability of success when they go to investing in other people's businesses. So somebody like me might say, well, the probability is lower than it actually is, and somebody who'd been phenomenally successful on, number one might have a very an inflated estimate of that probability. And that influences the way you invest in other businesses, sometimes to your disadvantage.
Yeah, and I found that one pretty fascinating and true, because a lot of us said, well, hey, we did this and we did very well here. But you just said, if you year over year, you have an 80% chance from your research to be successful the following year in your current business, but you do not have remotely that chance of success starting a new business or going another way. So,
yeah, and the other thing is, if you, if you're reinvesting in a business that's successful, so you're, I don't know, if you have a business with 10 million a year in free cash flow, then it's logical if that business is growing at, 30 or 50%, and it does require some reinvestment to make that reinvestment. But when you go from that to saying, well, let's invest that free cash flow in unrelated acquisitions, or, going from I sold the business, now I'm investing with my personal portfolio, you might still think that the probability that reinvestment would be effective would be 80% or more, but it's probably going to be a totally different probability. So
no, I think this is important for people to think about. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who, we have a couple of great hits, very high on our capabilities, and sometimes for very, very good reasons. But also, I think the overconfidence, sometimes it's just a good thing to keep, avoid the blind spots. And I remember this is something that we invested heavily in, actually, at Greenway. I want to say to the tune of, I think, $2 million we invested doing 360s for our leadership team, then coaching all of our leadership team up to go public. And we didn't leave it to chance. I mean, and you don't know your blind spots. That's kind of one of the things that, your talk here and your points are just so valid. But I didn't know all my blind spots, but Greenway invested heavily and finding what those are, and then how do I bridge those? How do I fix those? How do I eliminate those gaps, those blind spots that I have in my leadership skills? And then again, we poured years into fixing, helping coaching each of our senior managers up. So it was awesome.
Yeah, the companies that seem best at that have kind of Ray Dalia's policy of radical transparency, where anyone in the company can question anything that's going on or any perspective, whereas the companies that fail to do that are the ones where you only have one or two people, if anyone, truly asking, does this investment make sense? Right.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And we had that environment certainly in the last 5 years, 6, 7 years of operation before we went public. I mean, we were totally transparent. Anybody can ask anything. And we wanted people to challenge us. We wanted the far left thoughts and right thoughts and just things from all over the board to say, left field, right field, because we wanted to, we want to become bulletproof. And we really wanted to have answers to everything. And we called it, there were no sacred cows, none. Everything was up for grabs, zero-based budgeting every single year. Just because you might have a $10 million budget the year before does not mean you automatically have a $0.5 million budget the next year. It goes back to zero-based budgeting, and it made a huge difference in our organization. So for a few minutes on the importance of establishing financial metrics for success, and we get some neat thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets back a little bit to what we were talking about before. But if you start a very successful company, then you kind of take for granted a lot of things that make that company successful, which aren't the characteristics of many businesses. For example, it might be hard for somebody like Mark Zuckerberg to really fully understand the reasons that his business is such a great business compared with I don't know, a business like owning a sports team, or, I often see people make this sort of mistake where they assume that all businesses are as great as the one they first started. But once you look at, hundreds or thousands or, again, that kind of high level view of things, you kind of start to appreciate the different characteristics of different businesses. And when you're trying to combine a portfolio of different businesses to create combine businesses to create a portfolio, you need to actually say, what's my goal for the portfolio? And then how am I going to diversify and size positions to achieve that target? And you can't, there's no fine-grained way to do that. But if you're investing in an index fund, for example, you don't expect, 25% annualized returns over the next 10 years. It just isn't realistic because GDP is only growing at 2 or 3% or whatever. Whereas if you're investing in, high growth companies in Silicon Valley and you have a very high selection probability, then, maybe like Chris Sacca, you can do a 58% annualized return. So different sorts of asset classes have different sorts of returns. But I do think you have to have a goal for what your return should be. And then you have to realize that in order to achieve that level of return, you have to invest in businesses that compound internally at that target rate. So for example, if I want a 20% annualized compounding rate of return on a portfolio, I need on average businesses that are compounding their return on equity or their equity base at 20%, and same for 10% or 30% or whatever. It gets harder as you go higher.
Yeah, it certainly does. Well, hey, awesome, Graham. I got one final question for you, kind of lightning round, 30 seconds or less. What is your favorite place to get or be inspired? And I always ask this last question of my guests, and I'm certainly looking forward to your thoughts.
I mean, it's a variety of places. I love meeting with managements or entrepreneurs I oftentimes don't actually get to go to the annual meetings for the companies I'm invested in, but I try to attend their calls when I can, and looking at the progress a business makes is very fulfilling, particularly if it's doing well and you're making money over time. And the same goes for, companies that are pitching new ideas. I love kind of engaging with them in a critical but also productive way to hone my own skills, but also to get them thinking about risk factors. So both of those are kind of places I go.
Yeah, well, knowing that, I'm going to pull you in then because I get pitched a lot. And as I come across companies, a couple a year, I'll pull you in to kind of, I call it kick their teeth in, but, make them more bulletproof. And let's go find the faults. Let's go find the flaws in their operating model. So I'll call you into those meetings. So
absolutely.
All right, my friend.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Graham, great to have you on the show today. And I truly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. And please tune in weekdays, 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific to hear our latest shows. As always, you can track me on Twitter at HIT Advisor and use the hashtag ThisJustinRadio so we can respond to your comments from the show. If you miss any of this episode or want to hear more, all my shows are posted at Apple iTunes, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Google Play, and tune in. Also, check out the new website that we launched at justinbarnes.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a terrific week.